Welcome to Foucault 913 on the government of the living, the 1980 lectures. I would like immediately and first for us to immerse ourselves in this text for a moment, to get a sense of the different texture, the different medium of this new material. Recall that last seminar on the birth of politics, we were steeped in Hayek and Gary Becker and Giscard d'Estaing. By contrast, these 1980 lectures have an entirely different feel. Let me refer you to a passage on page 241 of the English lectures. It's page 236 of the French edition, where Foucault is analyzing the Stoic examination of conscience, in particular the essay On Anger by Seneca. There, Seneca is discussing his evening practice before sleep of reviewing his every action and passing them through the filter of his mind. When the light is lowered and my partner, familiar with my habit, has become silent, I examine with myself my whole day, and I take the measure again of my words and deeds. I measure them anew. I leave nothing out. And thus, in that discussion, Seneca says, "You spoke too aggressively. You reproached someone with too little reserve, and you did not correct him. On the contrary, instead of correcting him, you offended him. See to it that in the future what you say is not only true, but that the person whom you speak can bear the truth you tell him." In this Stoic examination of conscience, Foucault suggests Seneca is not searching inside himself for a deeper truth. He is not revealing a secret of the self. He is not exposing something about himself. He is reviewing his daily actions against the rules of conduct of which he is essentially reminding himself in order, prospectively, not to make the same mistakes again, not to hurt, rather to guide his interlocutor. The examination incorporates a form of recognition and a truth-telling about one's actions in a very particular and unique way. If we move forward 4 centuries to the time of Caligula, to early Christian direction at the time of Jean Cassien, the examination of conscience takes a different character. Here we can look at passages on page 300, 301. A different set of metaphors accompany the practice of examination. That of the miller, of the centurion, of the money changer. Here, the examination is intended to weed the good from the bad thoughts, to test the purity of one's thoughts, to determine whether the thoughts one is having are honest and faithful or the product of deceit. Middle of the page. What, in fact, does the money changer do? Cassien says the money changer is someone who checks the metal of the coin, who checks its nature, its purity, and also the image stamped on it, someone who questions the coin's origin. A little further down. First possibility. An idea comes to mind with all the brilliance of philosophical language. One thinks it pure gold, and God knows how philosophers can gild their ideas, but they are all the ideas of philosophers and not truly Christian. So they must be rejected. False metal. The contrast between the two passages is sharp. We have moved from an inspection afterwards, as he says on page 300, to a determination of the authenticity of my metal, to the question of the truth of I who thinks. It's these subtle transformations in the way in which we speak truth about ourselves, reveal our truths, manifest ourselves, and in the process link our subjectivity to truth that Foucault studies in these most minute details in 1980. A dissection of the multiple ways in the Roman period and early Christianity into the monastic period that the subject tied him or herself to these manifestations of truth. Examining many different rituals surrounding the truth of the self, rituals or liturgies of alethurgies, to play on that second meaning of alethurgy that Jesus Velasco insightfully discusses in his post on the blog. Jesus, incidentally, who will not be with us this evening because he is actively chairing his department as we speak. He sends his regrets. Foucault borrowed the term aléturgie expressly, as he notes, from the Greek grammarian Heraclite, who used it once to describe someone who speaks the truth. But as Jesus Velasco notes, the word cannot hide a second genealogy, the combination of aletheia and liturgy. We have here different liturgical manifestations of truth. These preoccupations were not entirely new for Foucault. We could identify similar preoccupations in 1970, 71, in 75, and 76. But they represent an amplification of his methodology that I suggest represents a third dimension to his work. To the first dimension of knowledge, of épistème, of savoir and connaissance, of the archaeology of knowledge, and the second dimension of power, of relations of power, of genealogies of power, of governmentality, Foucault's 1980 lectures launch the concerted work on the third dimension of subjectivity, of subjectivation, of truth-telling and avowal, that will occupy Foucault for the rest of his time at the Collège de France and lead him to explore the techniques of the self, the care of the self, parésia, and finally, the courage of truth. Many students of Foucault have misdiagnosed this moment as a radical shift from politics to ethics in his thought, something I hope that we'll avoid here. The intensification of his focus on themes related to subjectivity starting in 1980 and running through 1984 should be understood, I think, as complementing, filling out, and completing Foucault's political project, not as undermining it or offering an alternative path. One need only read closely the first lecture to see how Foucault is continuing his project with the birth of politics, or the last lecture, in fact, the last point on the penultimate page, page 312, where he writes, third and final point, this institutionalization of truth, subjectivity, relationships, through the obligation to tell the truth about oneself, the organization of this linkage cannot be conceived without the exercise and functioning of a form of power. To help us read and analyze and discuss these 1980 lectures, we're delighted to have three brilliant scholars. Achille Mbembe joins us from Wits University in South Africa via Harvard University, where he's visiting this year. Professor Mbembe taught here at Columbia before returning to Africa, first to Senegal and eventually to South Africa, and so we're especially delighted to welcome you back, Achille, to Columbia. He's the author of Critique de la Raison Nègre, 2013, On the Post-Colony, published in Paris in 2000, and before that, La naissance du maquis dans le Sud Cameroun. Jean Cohen is our own Nell and Herbert Singer Professor of Political Thought and Contemporary Civilization here at Columbia University. She is the author of numerous books, including most recently Regulating Intimacy, A New Legal Paradigm in 2002, and Globalization and Sovereignty, Rethinking Legality, Legitimacy, and Constitutionalism in 2012. Professor Cohen has also taught abroad at many institutions, including as a distinguished visiting professor at the Collège de France. Daniele Lorenzini joins us from Paris, where he teaches at the University of Paris-Est Créteil. He is the author most recently of Éthique et politique de soi, Foucault, Hadot, Cavell et les techniques de l'ordinaire, just came out with Vrin in 2015. And he's the co-editor of several of the Foucault volumes in the Vrin collection of Foucault's conferences, including most recently, as you know, or actually not most recently, but recently, Qu'est-ce que la critique, which just came out with Vrin, and several of the other conferences. He's also a founder and editor of the journal Materiali Foucaldiani, which is online and which I urge you to consult regularly. Now, before turning it over to Achille, let me also welcome the philosopher Rosi Braidotti, who's here with us now for a stay at the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, who is distinguished university professor at Utrecht University and will be in as many of these as possible. I also want to welcome again virtually the Minnesota Political Theory Workshop with Nancy Luxon, Shai Gortler, Samarit Ghosh, and Justin Hardy, and all of the colleagues in Minnesota who are going to be in conversation with us, And in addition, this time, we welcome friends and colleagues assembled at a very select club in Paris by the name of Silencio Club. It's a lot later in Paris than it is here, but from what I've heard, or what I've read, you in Paris have far more exotic cocktails than we do here. But in any event, we raise a toast to you all at Silencio, so welcome. We look forward to your questions. So we're also launching this evening our new website, Foucault 1313. I hope you've been able to see the new website. We are deeply grateful to our own Alex Gill, the Digital Scholarship Coordinator at the Columbia University Libraries and Chair of Global Outlook Digital Humanities. Alex created and produced the new website in close collaboration with our graduate students who have been leading so much of the work here. Rafael Burns, Luca Provenzano, Ibai Atuksa, and Agnese Kodebo, who's no longer in New York this semester. We hope the new website will create the ideal reader's companion to the Foucault lecture series. So with that, let me turn then to our first guest, Achille Membe, and welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. I think that the framing note you put on the website was extremely useful, at least for many of us. Reading Foucault in English is in itself an interesting adventure. I kept moving from the English text to the French original, hoping to remind myself of the exact voice the French text carries with it, and wondering whether it was the same voice that one could find in the English translation. I had the feeling that the title of the book is somewhat misleading. It could have probably had a different title. What title, I'm not sure. But it doesn't seem to me that the book is really about the government of the living. And in any case, I found the term government a little bombastic. I tended, especially in the opening two lectures, to feel a bit irritated by numerous digressions. But I soon realized that let's say the extent to which what looks like a series of digressions was in fact a very careful laying out of arguments that would later on become extremely clear. I think you're right to Bernard to suggest that in fact there is what he's dealing with in this book is not entirely displacement from his earlier problematics. But let me just, for the sake of our conversation this evening, put on the table once again what are his specific preoccupations in this book. The question Foucault asks is the following. How is it that in what he calls our type of society, which is the Christian West, to use a term he uses later on, how is it that power cannot be exercised without truth having to manifest itself? Having to manifest itself in the form of subjectivity. How is it the case? So the project, as I understood, is not so much about the history of truth as such, as the history of the force of truth. And the history of the force of truth in the West, the history of the ties by which, to quote him, men have gradually bound themselves in and through the manifestation of truth. That is the object of the book. How they have been somewhat led to bind themselves to very specific manifestations of truth, in which precisely it is they themselves who must be manifested in truth. Foucault has this way of constantly clarifying what he is after. And it's interesting to follow that exercise through every single lecture. In every single lecture, he reprecises, clarifies what it is that he is doing. And when you compile all that, these problematizations, it gives you a clear sense of what he is after. But as Bernard, you suggested earlier on, the question he's looking at is not simply that of how men, generic term, have bound themselves to the obligation of truth and to the status of object within this manifestation of truth. It is also how this regime of truth, by which they find themselves bound to manifest themselves as objects of truth, is linked to political, juridical, or even epistemological regimes. So that is the issue. And in trying to respond to, find a response to all these questions, he, let's say, introduces an inflection in his methodology, what he calls a transition from the notion of knowledge, power, to that of government by the truth. I won't go into that. It's quite clear for those who have read the book. The pages are found absolutely riveting in the book. Have to do, first of all, with the modes of telling the truth. It's fascinating that he avoids the kind of question, I don't know how you say it in English, but Pilate, le gouverneur romain. Pilate.
No, wait, that's not right.
Is it Pilate? Or yes, he avoids precisely. He's not asking the Pilate's type of question. When Jesus is on trial and he says, je suis la voie, I'm the way, I'm life, and I'm truth. And Pilate asks him, okay, what do you mean? What is truth? And Jesus, of course, doesn't answer the question, as if to tell Pilate, but the truth is just in front of you. How come you cannot recognize it? He talks about something else. So Foucault avoids that question, and he's interested in the modes of telling the truth. And especially that way of telling the truth in the first person. If I had time, I would comment on that, but I'm sure that is something that will come back during the discussion. So, what I found absolutely mind-blowing in the book is what Foucault tells us about baptism, his theology of baptism, and behind it, the whole idea of metanoia. And I would like to spend the rest of the minutes I have commenting on that theology of baptism and the concept of metanoia. Of course, the main argument is that, one of the main arguments in the book is that Christianity defined at least two great poles of regimes of truth. The first one is a regime of truth that revolves around what he calls the acts of faith. Acts of faith meaning what? Meaning basically the truths one accepts one commits oneself to, adheres to faithfully, affirms, and gives some external guarantees in accordance with a number of rules of conduct or rituals or obligations that ratify that. So that's the first pole. There's a second pole, according to him, which consists of acts of confession, understood, of course, as it was the case in the Middle Ages, as the verbalization of sins committed, verbalization that takes place in an institutional relationship with, of course, a confessor who is qualified to hear it, to fix a penalty, and to grant remission. And it's interesting the way in which Foucault makes a clear distinction between the verbal organization of the confession, what is translated in the book as confession, and the act of confession itself, which is translated in the book in terms of aveu. So it would be interesting to see whether, these are two different concepts, indeed, or whether there might be a way in which they can be collapsed. My own feeling is that the aveu has an element of confession, but it might be a bit more than just simple confession. That's something we can discuss. Let me make my comments on his theology of baptism and metanoia, which we find in lectures 5, 6, 7, and 8, which shows the importance of baptism in the overall economy of the text. So what is it that he means by metanoia? By metanoia, he means basically the change of the soul. Or to be more specific, the movement by which the soul pivots on itself. The movement by which it turns away from what until then it had been looking at. That the soul is looking at something, it turns on itself, and it distances itself from what it is that it had been looking at. It turns itself away from what it was attached to, basically, in this case, shadows, matter, the world, appearances. So it turns away from these shadows, from this matter, from the world here below, and it turns towards the light. The light being, in this case, the equivalent of the truth that illuminates the soul. This is the first moment in the book where I find some kind of definition of the truth as such. I'm not sure that elsewhere in the book he comes as close as this to a definition of the truth. So this question of illumination of what is hidden, illumination of what is invisible, this making the invisible visible, this is, according to him, indeed what, let's say, the center of gravity of subjectivity, if you want. That if there is a center of gravity of what we call subjectivity, this is where it is. That to some extent, metanoia, the changing of the soul, is to a large extent what Foucault means by subjectivity, the turning of oneself into another. So this is quite interesting then, that not only is subjectivity related to regeneration, but that fundamentally it is related to some form of becoming other. Matter of being recreated from top to bottom. So, if you want to just make one final comment on this question of subjectivity and truth, subjectivity in this text has to do with a set of questions Foucault asks a bit later. How to become other. How to cease being what one is. And how, being what one is, can we become completely other, not partially, but completely other. And how, being in this world, how do we pass to another? This is the kernel of Foucault's problematization of subjectivity. Now, let me end with one or two comments on what seems to me to be at stake here, which is still speaking to our age. Doesn't simply speak to those early centuries of Christianity. It is a question of our own times. And this is the question of the relationship between salvation and the truth. It seems to me that when we look at the politics of our world today, what is being played out, whether in the violence of the religious or the violence of the market or other forms of violence, is precisely the difficulty we have in responding to this question: what is the relationship between salvation and the truth? That sense, it seems to me that there are a number of pointers in Foucault's text that could help us to, let's say, go a bit further than we have so far. I mentioned two or three quickly. It's underpinning Foucault's text or reading of early Christianity is a very interesting political concept of the community or of the common. The community as that which is characterized by the fact that its members are always at risk of sinning, but of sinning without having the church driving them out. A community of truth is one of mercy, of forgiveness and kindness. It's also a community where salvation has to do with the salvation of the whole body, meaning the salvation of all. That we cannot save ourselves just by ourselves and alone. That salvation is about the salvation of the whole body. And it's a community that is prepared to always start anew. This question of recommencement. So it seems to me that there are there a few pointers which allow us somewhat to articulate a critique of our times that takes into consideration the yearning for salvation in these very difficult times of ours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for asking me here to to speak about the government of the living. I had the same feeling about the word, about the title. I expected something very different in this text, but it is about government after all. Government of the self, by the self, but we'll get to that. I have a long blog post. I won't read it, that's for sure, but I want to just highlight a few things in it and raise some questions. More from the external perspective, which is actually usually Foucault's own perspective, so I think it fits. I wanted to point out some continuity, discontinuity with last time, basically to say that, to pick up on the theme that there was some debate over the complicity between Foucault and neoliberalism last time, and the not unrelated question regarding the analysis of civil society at the end of the volume. Now, to the point. This is picking up on last week's discussion. I think it's quite right that social bonds, Foucault mentions in the other text families, tribes, and corporations as per Ferguson, but I would add, and have added in other texts, associations, publics, movements, networks, etc. These cannot be reduced to the intersection of the interests of economic actors, he's right, of economic rationality, nor to the administrative rationality of the political system. And it's also correct that the understanding and analysis of the concept of civil society began to shift in the late 18th century, where it became understood as a part, not the whole, of social life. Okay, that raised a whole other set of questions, and part of that was discussed last time concerning the relation of the concept of civil society as remedy, as alternative to, or whatever, to neoliberalism. That's not the question that I want to raise today. Actually, I want to pick up on another side of this, and I think it's fair because Foucault himself mentions it, namely the relationship between Foucault's concept of civil society and anarchism. Anarchism, and he mentions this in our text for today. Okay, so just a few asides. We can discuss it, fight about it later, but anyway, he tries to clarify his understanding of anarchism in the government of the living because he's been accused of being an anarchist. And he says, if anarchy or anarchism means, and this relates to civil society, it's too complicated to go into, but we can. So if anarchy means no power warrants being taken for granted, that power has no intrinsic legitimacy, he finds this unobjectionable. All power only ever rests on the contingency and fragility of a history. There's no universal, immediate, and obvious right that can everywhere and always support any relation of power. Indeed. But what I ask is anarchist about this point. One need not be an anarchist to make such statements about not taking any power for granted, denying power's intrinsic legitimacy, and any universal or immediate right, or insisting in a systematic way on the non-necessity of all power of any kind, if this non-necessity means non-self-evidence. You don't have to be an anarchist to say any of that. So he further elaborates with a démenti. He says, if anarchism means power is essentially bad, and it entails a project of a society in which every relation of power is abolished, then he's not proposing this, he says. Instead, he says, his position does not exclude anarchy, but it doesn't entail it. All very tantalizing statements, but I don't know what it means. So the question is, what's odd is that the word anarchy doesn't mean no power, it means no rule. So I have two questions. Much of my comments are going to be in the form of questions. If the issue is the interrogation of the ways in which power is actually accepted and rendered apparently inevitable, what relation would such an enterprise have, if any, to the issue of finding or devising standards for assessing the acceptability of a mode of power, rule, either by participants or participant observers like ourselves? Second, how does Foucault's anarchizing interpretation of civil society map onto the no power or non-acceptability of power, and what relation does this have to do with his alleged flirtation of neoliberalism? Okay, I'm done with that. Now, the government of the living. It was already said that he shifts from regimes of truth, the power knowledge duality to regimes of truth. But there's an earlier shift. And that shift is from ideology. So there's three things: ideology critique, power knowledge, regimes of truth. And so there are two shifts that he talks about. And the target of the first shift is obviously Marxism, maybe Althusser, I don't know. So first, ideology / power knowledge. So what Foucault says about the notion of dominant ideology is that it's pegged to a set of oppositions: true, false, reality, illusion, science, scientific, unscientific, rational, irrational. And the term dominant allegedly leads us to overlook the real mechanisms of subjection. Okay, so he first tries out the knowledge power thing, and actually the way that what that leads to is looking into how the distinctions between scientific, unscientific, true, false, reality, illusion, invalidate certain knowledges, validate others, etc. We know this, okay? The second shift is from power knowledge to regimes of truth, or government by regimes of truth. And government is understood as the mechanisms and procedures intended to direct men's conduct or to conduct their conduct. And his topic in these lectures is government linked to, as we saw, the problem of truth and knowledge with respect to the constitution of the reflexive subject. I wouldn't say the other. I'd say the reflexive subject. But anyway. And what are the techniques and mechanisms that are deployed in the process of this construction, okay, of subjectivity? I'll get to that in a minute. But I have to say, I can't let this pass. The Marxian conception of ideology was and is much richer than Foucault's rather simplistic opposition of true, false, reality, illusion, etc., that it makes it out to be. So just in Marx alone, the modes of ideology critique are numerous, including, at the very least, unmasking critiques, defetishizing critiques, immanent critique, transcendent critique, and so on. So, for example, Das Kapital, the book, as it were, didn't contrast truth to illusion, but analyzes how in the domain of appearance, which is something altogether different than illusion, the ideology of the equivalence exchange is correct, apt or true insofar as it pertains to the market mechanism's logic. While the point of the defetishizing critique you find there, Lukács called it dereification, is to reveal the dynamics by which relations between persons you know the drill, turn into relations between things via the commodification of labor, commodity form. Okay, this is not a naive truth-illusion distinction. Anyway, there are other more complex, things have happened since Marx, but anyway, I just want to say, or actually ask, the following question, is there a role for ideology critique, or for the concept of ideology in a Foucauldian approach? Put differently, should we construe the Foucauldian enterprise as a supplement, an alternative, as another and very important, in my view, way of doing critical analysis, or as a replacement? Why can't we do both? Okay, I'll leave that one there. Okay, now the next section is called silences. One silence I'm not going to say anything about, but I was just sort of surprised that I don't think, again, maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't see any reference to Augustine's Confessions, but I'm not talking about that silence, please. The other silence, actually, I think is more important and interesting. So the text reveals the new specific modes of government of the self, through self-interrogation and all of this, and particularly the regime of truth in Christianity. But there is an absent presence in this text that is so overwhelmingly obvious to anyone who ever reflected on the religious origins of our contemporary concept of life that the lack of mention of his name is astounding. And I'm talking about Max Weber, which doesn't make me a Weberian. But, it's true that Weber didn't write about sexuality or subjectivation. These weren't his terms. But he did write about the making of the modern Western individual, the cultural transformations and the new techniques of discipline and self-interrogation involved in Christianity, especially through the monastery and those techniques of discipline and self-interrogation, and in particular in relation to the anxiety about what? Salvation. And he did write about the transformations of the modes of confession and penance. If anybody bothered to look beyond the Protestant ethic, although a hell of a lot is already in that text, but he has reams of texts. He calls it sociology of religion. Don't get distracted by the word. It's about this. It's about the making of the modern individual, and he's not too pleased at the result. But in any case, and it's through many of the terms, and Foucault, of course, knew Weber. This was all over the place in the 70s. I know since I was there too. So he has a book on the religions of China and India. Anyway, I'm not going to go into this. The main point is that it's all about the focus is religious ethics, action-orienting norms of religious ethics, in terms of transforming modes of conduct and cultural transformations, of course. And of course, the focus is on the inner worldly asceticism of the Protestant that steps out of the monastery into the world, vis-a-vis the conduct of life in self-surveillance. Okay, my point is not to denounce Foucault for not mentioning Weber, although I'm less than pleased that he didn't do it. But the point is rather, had he done it, he could have. It would have been so illuminating for him to reflect on, and for us to see the difference and the changes in the way Foucault does this analysis himself. That would have been, a nice thing to see. Because one would ask, given that so much of the stuff is in Weber, is there anything new and original and different? And there is in Foucault. But, it would have been nice. Anyway, Weber's focus is on the action-orienting and reorienting ethics and structural relations involved in the relationship and mode of access to a transcendent type of God, the disciplinary, interrogative, and inner-worldly aesthetic ethical conduct of life that creates the modern individual. Again, he doesn't use the word subject. The key difference, and what Foucault zeroes in on, is actually discourse. So it's not the techniques. I mean, Weber has this too. He knows this techniques. You have to confess he knows this. But Foucault puts foreground, foremost in the center. You got to talk about this stuff, right? So it's the discourse that's the central addition or shift and focus. And of course, they have a different aim. I mean, Weber's analyzing capitalism, this iron cage, how to get out of it. Foucault is doing something else. It's to discover, as Achilles said, how it is that in our type of society, power can't be exercised without truth, having to manifest itself in the form of subjectivity, with effects that go beyond the realm of knowledge and belong to salvation, et cetera, et cetera. So what's a regime of truth? Should I go into that? It's that which constrains individuals to a certain number of truth acts that defines and determines the forms of these acts. So he says, we talk about political regimes. Why not talk about different regimes of truth? I think that's sort of nice. And then there's the faith-confession dichotomy. And of course, Foucault's focus is not on faith, in other words, the actual beliefs, what Christians actually believe in, or dogma, but l'aveu and confession. I think the question of how I like the word avowal because it has the discursive thing. But anyway, so and the point is that we have to constantly interrogate ourselves because our salvation is uncertain, our purity is uncertain, and this is how, according to Foucault, Western Christian men, that's supposedly us. I'm going to get back to that in a second. Bound himself to the obligation to tell the truth and what he himself is. And there's a nice distinction between the ancient modes of direction and self-reflection. Bernal talked about this, and the Christian one. Because he says, interestingly enough, the goal of, for example, Greek ascesis was autonomy. To get at the rational principles of conduct, not to reveal the secrets of the heart, to figure out, well, I need some guidance here. This is the way the world is, or this is the way, maybe there's an illumination moment, but it's not about revealing the secrets of the heart. It's about autonomy in the world. Whereas for the other one, the Christian one, once the ecclesiastical institution takes over and turns it into relationship to the truth as dogma and relation of the self to themselves, the goal is, of course, submission, but also, I would say, speaking of the heart, it's authenticity. That's a whole other ballgame. Now, I have some questions. I'll close with some questions because I'm trying not to do this too long. Given all of this huge continent of stuff, Weber's is, of course, a secularization story regarding inner-worldly asceticism, the making of the modern individual, the modern conduct of life. Capitalism, to put it simply, capitalism needed religious supports. It no longer does. Once the system gets off the ground, it dispenses with its religious orientation foundation. Is Foucault's story a secularization story also? That's question one. Question two, Weber thought that only new prophets, religious or secular, and he was pretty prescient about this, could develop a new action-orienting and reorienting norms and meanings to break through the iron cage that the secularized, disciplined, self-monitoring subjects live in and provide alternatives to the loss of meaning and loss of freedom he thought true of modern Western society. Yet he feared populist and plebiscitary prophets. What about Foucault? How to revalorize the world and develop an ethics of care of the self, some of the later books, that escapes this Christian imaginary, yet entails the reflexivity that Foucault himself displayed about identity, including his own. Does one need to turn to new prophets? Or what other ways are there to generate the new man or the child? It's a nod to Nietzsche. And what new action reorienting norms, mechanisms, practices, techniques would do the trick? He does talk about it, but anyway. All right, I have another question, which is not on the blog. Are we Western, are we all of us, Western Christian men or people? Christian, what? I mean, I think that's something we should think about. Are we simply secularized Christians? Is there any way out of here, out of this? That's Bob Dylan. Last question is, doesn't the faith l'aveu, the faith avowal, or faith confession distinction, in its still, and I'm not obsessed with this, but still leave an important space for ideology critique, especially since, to get up to the present, we've got a lot of religion coming back. It's not over. Religion is everywhere. And you can't have the anxiety about salvation and get into all these practices of torturing and constructing the self if you don't believe in and have faith in something that's you're worried about, namely, for example, the afterlife. So I don't know what the secularized version of this, but even there, especially today, you might need ideology critique in addition to Foucault's fabulous genealogical analysis. Thanks.
Thank you. So, first of all, thank you, Bernard, and Jesus also for this invitation. It is a pleasure for me to be here. As I have announced in the text published on the blog, among the many issues that could be raised in relation to the government of the living, I've chosen to focus on the link Foucault establishes in these lectures between two of the main philosophical and political projects he never ceased to pursue in his works of the 70s and the 80s. The project of a history of truth, or of a history of force of truth, as Achille puts it, and the project of a genealogy of the modern Western subject. In my post, I evoked some of the main features of the first project, exploring in particular the shape it takes in On the Government of the Living, where Foucault redefines the concept of regime of truth and announces his willingness to retrace the history of the regimes of truth in Western societies, or better, a genealogy of our regime of truth indexed to subjectivity, or at least what Foucault considers to be our regime of truth, our dominant regime of truth. And this is something that we can, of course, question here. Therefore, as I have pointed out, Foucault's 1980 definition of a regime of truth is no longer modeled on the notion of power knowledge. He rather defines it as that which determines the obligations of individuals with regard to the procedures of manifestation of truth, thus explicitly introducing this third dimension Bernard was talking about, the dimension of subjectivity, and raising at the same time a crucial ethico-political question. Why does the regime of truth that he considers to be dominant in our contemporary Western society require from the individual to say not only, here I am, me who obeys, but in addition, this is what I am, me who obeys? In other words, according to Foucault, in our contemporary Western societies, the dominant regime of truth asks the individual to tell the truth about herself, to discover her hidden truth in herself, and to tell it to the others. And it is precisely through this production of truth that the individual is governed. It is true, therefore I submit. The acceptance by the individual of a series of mechanisms of power which govern her everyday life is essentially based on her implicit or explicit acceptance of this therefore, which in turn gives rise to a process of constitution of a specific form of subjectivity. A subjugated subjectivity, we could say, une subjectivité assujettie. Therefore, every regime of truth requires the individuals who are implicated in it to engage in a specific self-constitution. There is always a specific subject associated to a regime of truth, a subject who constitutes herself and is constituted by this very regime of truth precisely when and as long as she accepts the therefore that links the it is true and the I submit. This is why, in On the Government of the Living, Foucault's long-term project of a history of truth is essentially coupled and articulated with another project, a project that Foucault explicitly describes in his lectures at Dartmouth College in the terms of a genealogy of the modern subject. It is on this second project that I will focus today. First of all, I will explore the way in which Foucault analyzes the Christian regime of confession, aveu, as the historical framework where a relation between the government of the human being and reflexive truth acts has been constituted. That is to say, as a fundamental piece of the genealogy of the regime of truth indexed to subjectivity that characterizes our contemporary Western societies. I will then address the issue of the role of the individual's will in Foucault's account of the process of subjection, assujettissement, and subjectivation, subjectivation, within the Christian and the modern Western regimes of truth. The problem of the translation of aveu confession is of course a critical problem. In French, in his French text, Foucault points out somewhere that he uses confession to refer to the practice of avowal it has been institutionalized by the Council of Trento starting from the 13th century and so on. And so I kind of have the impression, even if its use of these two terms is not always consistent with that he uses avowal, aveu, in a more general sense, and confession, confession in more specific sense. So let's begin. In the inaugural conference of his 1981 Louvain series of lectures, Wandering Truth Telling, Foucault refers to the famous scene in which the French psychiatrist François Leray forces, through a series of repeated cold showers, one of his patients to confess his own mental illness and thus cures him. Even if to make someone suffering from mental illness recognize that he's mad is a very ancient procedure based on the idea of the incompatibility between madness and recognition of madness, Foucault rightly notes that something strange is happening here, since in the mid-18th century, the treatment of madness already tried to organize along the same line as medical practice, that is, to obey the dominant model of pathological autonomy. The new truth therapy, in order to discover the truth of the illness, required the doctor to observe the symptoms of the body rather than to listen to the discourse of the patient. Therefore, according to Foucault, we can detect behind this scene the transposition within psychiatric therapy of a very old religious and judicial procedure, namely this long history of avowal, these long-held beliefs in the powers and the effects of truth-telling in general, and in particular of truth-telling about oneself. In his numerous analysis of the practice of confession, Foucault's main objective was to study the complex set of relations between subjectivity, truth, and power in Western societies, and to question the postulate according to which, for one's own salvation, or in order to be healed, one needs at some point to tell the truth about oneself to someone else. As Foucault puts it in the first volume of his History of Sexuality, confession in Western societies has long been and still is one of the main rituals we rely on for the production of truth, a ritual which has spread its effects far and wide in medicine, education, family and love relations, and in almost every circumstance of our everyday life. However, we should be careful and avoid, I think, the idea that confession is just a technique imposed on the individuals from the outside, and whose effects are limited to the production of a certain discourse of truth about a fixed and pre-existing subject. Confession is, of course, according to Foucault, a technique of power and potentially of domination, but on the one hand, in the strictest sense, an avowal is necessarily free, since it is an engagement. This means that, on the other hand, through the procedure of confession, the individual is produced as a subject who bonds herself to the truth she confesses. Therefore, if one gets rid of the injunction to confess and of the mechanisms of power linked to it, one does not finally free one's own true self or nature, since there is no such a thing, according to Foucault. In On the Government of the Living, as we have seen, Foucault elaborates on the notion of regime of truth in order to stress the necessary co-implication in Western societies of the exercise of power in the form of the government of individuals on the one hand, and the truth acts that these individuals are required to perform on the other. Besides, through this notion, Foucault aims to stress even more clearly that the production by an individual of a certain true discourse about herself, confession being, of course, the most relevant example of such a discourse, is at the same time a way for the individual to produce herself as a specific subject, a subject tied to the truth she verbalizes. It is worth noticing, however, that this process can take many different forms. It takes the form of a subjection, assujettissement, when the individual is required to tell the truth about herself in order for a certain mechanism of power to govern her, as in the example of Léoret. But it can also take the form of an objectivation, objectivation, when the truth of the individual is extracted from her through a clinical examination without the necessity for the individual to speak, or better, thanks to a clinical codification of the inducement to speak that combines techniques as interrogation, questionnaire, and hypnosis in order to reinscribe the procedure of confession in a field of scientifically acceptable observations. Confession has here a completely different meaning, since the discourse produced by the individual no longer has to tell the truth about herself. Instead, it forms a set of more or less confused raw data that her interlocutor, the doctor, has to interpret in order to extract the truth about her illness. And there's also a third form, which can be taken by the processes of constitution of subjectivity, a form that represents one of the main cores of Foucault's work of the 80s, when in order to refer to more autonomous ways of constituting oneself as a subject through a certain set of practices or techniques of the self, Foucault speaks of subjectivation. Subjectivation implies two moments. A first, reactive moment, a moment of desubjection or de-objectivation, which consists in resisting and trying to get rid of the mechanisms of power that govern the individual within a certain regime of truth. And second, creative moment, which is strictly speaking the moment of subjectivation, that is, of the relatively autonomous invention of a different form of subjectivity, implying at the same time a series of practices of freedom and the inauguration, according to Foucault, of new way of life. It is within this framework that, second and last part of my intervention, I would like to raise the issue of the practices of resistance vis-à-vis a given regime of truth, and the related issue of the role of the individual's will in Foucault's account of the processes of subjection and subjectivation. To do so, let me get back to Foucault's Security, Territory, Population lectures, where he forges the notion of counterconduct as the correlative of that of conduct. Thanks to these notions, as Arnold Davidson has shown, it becomes possible to take into account the essential link between ethics and politics, and to highlight the strategic role played by the relationship of oneself to oneself in the government of human beings, as well as in the possibility to resist it. As you know, the notion of conduct seemed particularly appropriate to Foucault because of its intrinsic ambiguity. Indeed, the concept of conduct has a threefold meaning: to conduct someone, conduire; to be conducted by someone, être conduit, or better, to let oneself be conducted, c'est laisser conduire, or to conduct oneself, c'est conduire. Thus, if to exercise power means to try to conduct the conduct of others, that is to say, to try to structure the possible field of action of others, freedom constitutes the very condition for the exercise of power, or better, of this specific form of power that Foucault calls government. Government can only be exercised on free individuals, and only as long as they remain free, that is to say, as long as they are faced with a field of possibilities in which several ways of behaving, several reactions, and diverse comportments may be realized. Therefore, the complex dynamic that structures government of human beings can be described as a permanent tension between these three dimensions: conduire, se laisser conduire, and se conduire, where the linchpin role is, of course, played by the middle elements. Between the government mechanisms of power trying to conduct the individual in a specific way and the possibility the individual has to conduct herself in a relatively autonomous way, the field of her freedom is defined by her acceptance or refusal to be conducted by this particular mechanism, to let herself be conducted in this specific way. It is in this possibility of refusal that consists the first necessary step of a practice of resistance, namely a counter-conduct. In his 1978 conference, What is Critique?, Foucault elaborates on these ideas and suggests to define critique as an ethico-political attitude whose core is constituted by the will not to be governed thusly, like that, by these people at this cost. But how should we interpret this formula? During the 12 March 1980 lecture On the Government of the Living, Foucault raises the problem of obedience in Christian spiritual direction, arguing that the submission of one's own will to the will of the other does not consist in a transfer of sovereignty, because in Christian spiritual direction there is no renunciation of will by the individual. It is only in these lectures, indeed, that Foucault explicitly claims that Christian spiritual direction requires, as a sine qua non condition, the positive exercise of the disciple's will. In order for the master to govern her, to conduct her conduct, the disciple's will must remain intact, since it is essential for the good functioning of the relationship of direction that the disciple wants her will to be entirely submitted to that of her master, who is supposed to tell her in every circumstance what she must will. As a consequence, the link which ties the disciple and master is free and voluntary, and the direction itself will last function and unfold only insofar as the one directed still wants to be directed, because she's always free to choose wanting to be directed. This game of full freedom in the acceptance of the bond of direction, as Foucault calls it, is crucial. Christian spiritual direction does not rely fundamentally on constraint, threat, or sanction. The structure of obedience constitutes, of course, the condition and effect of Christian spiritual direction, but we should not consider it as a perfectly all-subjugating machine. Its force lies in the fact that it constantly rests upon the individual's free will to be conducted. But this is also its weak spot, because the I want, which is essential for the good functioning of pastoral government and of government in general, can never be abolished. Therefore, it can always, at least in principle, shift and become an I don't want anymore. Through the notions of critique and critical attitude, Foucault emphasizes the importance in every practice of resistance of the exercise of a counter-will, since in order to break the governmental relationship of obedience, the individual must withdraw her consent to be conducted like that. To do so, as we have seen, she has to contest and detach from the form of subjectivity that these specific governmental techniques and the specific regime of truth aim at constituting and imposing on her. But contesting the form of subjectivity that is imposed on individuals in order to build another subjectivity is not an easy task. In fact, if the concrete functioning of governmental mechanisms of power rests on the freedom of individuals, it is also essential to governmentality to produce discourses that neutralize this freedom, thus giving them the impression that there is no real choice to be made. The different forms of governmental power have indeed in common one crucial feature. They can operate exclusively on the basis of an original consent, of an I want, which has to be reiterated at every moment by the individuals, but they constantly reinscribe it within the framework of a you must, aiming at convincing them that this consent is the only choice they have if they wish to achieve salvation, happiness, well-being, freedom, and so on. Therefore, and to conclude, the possibility to say I don't want to be governed, directed, conducted like that, in other words, the possibility to withdraw one's own consent to be governed in this specific way, is masked from the beginning, presented as inaccessible, or constructed as something essentially non-desirable. And I think we have here a powerful insight on how we are still governed today. This is why, in On the Government of the Living, articulating a history of truth and a genealogy of the modern Western subject, Foucault's objective is clearly political. It tries to unmask this governmental trap, thus giving us the chance to see it and to open the space for the practice of a counter-will and eventually the experimentation of new ways of being subjects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniele. So these three marvelous comments raise so many questions that I don't think that I'm going to be able to harness the conversation this time, as I've tried in the past. But I will try to put a spotlight on three particular issues. First, making a few quick points, though, about title, about avowal, but then maybe putting a spotlight on three issues, one being what Achille raised about the contemporary resonances between salvation and truth, or other ways of thinking about these lectures today. What Jean raised about the relationship to ideology in Weber, I think, which is worth interrogating. And then, Daniele, some of the questions of subjectivity, truth, and power, particularly at the end of your talk, about the role of power and how to understand it. Quickly on the title, I mean, I think it's important to remember that Foucault had to give titles at the end of the previous year. And so that has always created a little bit of a problem, and it has always created some confusion as to what the courses are going to be about. We saw it last time with the birth of biopolitics, right? He was going to study biopolitics in the sense of continuing the conversation from Security, Territory, Population, and from History of Sexuality, Volume 1, directly on biopolitics, but then he ended up talking about liberalism, liberal thought, liberal rationalities, neoliberalism, which he then explains you have to understand neoliberalism in order to get to biopolitics. And he says that in a few places, particularly at the end. In other words, you had to do this work on neoliberalism and our contemporary forms of rationality in order to get back to biopolitics, which I think he fully intended to do with the title, The Government of the Living, which was essentially a signal from spring 79 that the next lectures would be that continuation. But something happens, and once again, the title then doesn't perfectly reflect what happens with his intellectual parcours over the months that lead to these lectures. But it does lead to questions of continuity that I think are very important, and that I'll come back to in a second, after making a quick comment about aveu and avowal. And that's right. When Steve Sawyer was translating Wrongdoing, Truth-Telling, the function of avowal in justice, we had long agonizing conversations about how to translate aveu, confession, etc. And it became clear, maybe even clearer in the context of Wrongdoing, Truth-Telling, which are the Louvain lectures from '81, which are lectures that span from, Homer and the kind of the relationship between Menelaus and Antilochus, all the way to contemporary forms of kind of admissions of guilt. It became very clear there that actually, of course, the notion of aveu is much larger than the notion of confession. It's saying something about oneself. And so we made the decision to use avowal there in that book throughout, except in those few places where Foucault himself used the word confession, which he was using in a more limited sense. But I think, that's worth thinking about, because it presents itself more as an issue, I think, in English than it might in French. But it highlights something about the French that's very important, which is that we're talking about something about a truth-telling about oneself that is much larger than the narrower notion of confessions. Okay, then, now, the title does raise these questions about continuities. So let me start there, because I think there's this really interesting passage in Security, Territory, Population, and this is in the English edition of Security, Territory, Population at 123, where he's starting the genealogy, as you know. He is before he goes back to the pastoral, and he actually is this is an exercise of reading Oedipus in Security Territory Population in 1978. And after reading Oedipus and coming up with the different ways in which there were notions of governing, he says, I do not think that the idea that one could govern men or that one did govern men was a Greek idea. Right? And he says this, and that's what leads him to, and he talks about Plato and the statesman, and then he says, no, I think it's something about pre-Christian East, the pre-Christian East, and maybe it's pastoral power. And so he gets pushed in the direction of pastoral power, which is where he begins the genealogy, which would lead us, I would argue, to neoliberalism today. To a certain extent, I think that he's revisiting that claim, and he's kind of correcting himself and saying, no, maybe I made a mistake. I mean, he doesn't say this in The Government of the Living, but I think that to a certain extent we can read The Government of the Living as another point, another juncture where he kind of re-questions something and says, no, I think actually I do need to go back maybe to the Stoics, or maybe I need to go further back, right? And that is what The Government of the Living becomes, a going back. In that sense, it is a continuity, in the sense that it's an earlier return to create this genealogy that leads to forms of governing, forms of the arts of governing, forms of governmentality. And that's the sense in which I think we're in complete continuity here, and that makes it more important for us than to link, as I'll end these quick comments on, to link all the work that he's about to do on this history of subjectivity back to notions of knowledge and power. Okay, now, and that raises the important question of the relationship to ideology, which is an important one. Now, it should be said that Foucault himself was clearly conscious of the proximities, and there's this beautiful passage in an interview in 83 in Telos, where he remarks, referring specifically to the Frankfurt School, that, quote, nothing is better at hiding the common nature of a problem than two relatively close ways of approaching it, right? And so there is a certain acknowledgement that the proximity actually may have occluded some of the kind of conversation that could have occurred. I nevertheless would say that I would maintain the position that there remains a difference in epistemological sensibilities between the approaches that is very important, and that sensibility and that question, the epistemological question, is the most important one, and it does, even if it's, of course, too easy to reduce, it's always too easy to reduce one's opponent to something simple, such as, it's about delusions or not. But there's the sensibility of delusion or something that is the difference, I would say. And even in very sophisticated readers of the Frankfurt School, there is a sense of that notion that distinguishes, I would say, Foucault from that. Raymond Geuss, very brilliant scholar in The Idea of a Critical Theory, when you read that very closely.
Bad representative.
Okay. Bad represent. Okay, all right. Okay, well, I'll leave it at that, and then we can have the whole conversation. Okay, it is something about the sensibility of what it is that is going on, and so for that, I think maybe we should just go back to the text, not to the text in terms of the kind of, I don't know, not in terms of the explicit theorization, but actually what he's doing, right? And then to see, how does that relate to ideology? How would we think about it in terms of ideology, or not, or so? So we could look at page 266, for instance. I mean, I think there's so many passages where he's doing this rich appreciation of what it is that we are doing at various points in some of the history. 266. At the heart of what is distinctive about Christian direction, he says. You go down a little bit, that page. What is involved, in fact, is the joining together of the two following obligations: to obey in everything and to hide nothing. Joining together the principle of willing nothing by oneself with the principle of telling all by oneself, telling all about oneself, hiding nothing, willing nothing by oneself, obeying in everything. The juncture between these two principles is at the heart of not only the Christian monastic institution, etc., to obey and to tell. Okay, so we're looking very closely at this kind of these absolute fundamental set of arrangements, specific relations between the subject. Okay, so we get that. We could look at Clement of Alexandria. This is about 200 years later than the Stoic examination of the self, on page 253, on the bottom of 253. So here the examination is very different than Seneca, he writes. There's nothing of that sort of judicature and inspection that we saw in Seneca. What is this passage of Clement? One knows oneself so that one can have access to knowledge of God, that is to say, so that one can recognize what is divine in oneself, so that one can recognize the part or element of the soul that is of divine form, principle, origin, at any rate in contact with God. So a very different texture in the way in which one is recognizing oneself, which is different, of course, from the baptism and the penance. So we have a nice passage on page 226 where he's going into this in page 226. It seems to me that the reason for this is that in baptism and in penance and in forgiveness, it is not a question of grasping the subject as he is, deep down in his identity and continuity, but rather of making the manifestation of the truth a sort of de-identification of the subject, since it involves turning someone who was a sinner into someone who is no longer a sinner. And we have a series of kind of historical illustrations that go back and forth trying to understand. Tertullian, of course, is different on page 146. This is an injunction to tell me who you are. You have to go to the truth. But on the way, don't forget to tell me who you are, because if on the way you do not tell me who you are, you will never arrive at the truth. This is the point of the analysis I'd like to undertake here. And there was another really interesting passage. I forget if it's in Clement, I think it is, where this lover meets his former lover, and but he has changed in the process, right? And I can't find the passage right now, but it's a beautiful passage where she confronts him and says, "It's me, don't you remember me?" And he says, "Well, it's not me anymore," right? And so these are very fine kind of trying to get at all of these fine, minute differences in the way in which we might say something about ourselves and how it affects us, how the truth affects us. Now, so I think it would be great for us to interrogate exactly how that differs, what work is being done here that might be different. And I know for myself, and this goes back to Achille's comments about kind of contemporary resonances, I know that for myself in the work that I do, often on the criminal justice system, when I look at practices of plea bargaining today in the United States and the admissions of guilt, I see the resonances of these questions loud and clear. And I also see the importance of trying to understand the way in which admissions of guilt in this context today continue, or are modifications, or are taught, or are patterns that somehow relate back to these other forms. The practices of truth-telling about oneself imposed by a criminal justice system that gives you the choice to languish at Rikers Island for years, 3 years in the case of Khalif Browder, who committed suicide recently, most of those years in solitary confinement, either that choice or to kind of cop a plea, to go to court, say, yes, I plead guilty, and by doing so to assume a kind of responsibility in a system that transforms that truth-telling about oneself, which of course is not necessarily truthful, right? But a supposed truth-telling about oneself into that transforms an event about truth-telling that implies the I, the auto, etc., into a record, kind of a criminal history that's entirely detached from the subject himself, that makes a trace, leaves a mark, leaves a brand from which someone can't separate themselves afterwards. Those practices and those practices, I think, today need to be examined in relationship to these earlier practices to find out their continuities and resonances. On Weber, of course, Weber was a relatively important figure in Naissance de la Biopolitique the year before, and doesn't appear here, although he will appear in later interviews, etc. I would recommend here the work of a professor of philosophy at the Catholic University in Sao Paulo, Marcio Alves da Fonseca, who is actually writing about Foucault and Weber, and we'll have a book on that soon. And then that raises, I think that raises, though, questions about the relationship to power again. And finally, Daniele points to these questions, I think. He recognizes, of course, that confession is, of course, a technique of power, according to Foucault, so that's clear. But you raise the question, we should be careful and avoid the idea that confession is just a technique imposed on individuals from the outside. That notion of imposition and the way in which imposition plays a role in these practices of avowal, I think, is tricky and hard, and we need to think about it deeply. You can take a passage at random. You can look, for instance, at page 103 of these lectures and just see how there is this notion of imposition, or how complicated it is, right? Throughout that page, you get Christianity imposed on individuals the obligation to manifest in truth what they are, not simply in the form of consciousness of self. You go further down, since the origin of Christianity established a certain relation between the obligation of the individual to tell truth and the debt of evil, or how were the obligation to individually manifest one's truth and the extinction of the debt of evil articulated in Christianity, right? Or the next sentence, this connection between the manifestation of the individual truth and remission of sins was organized, right? These terms, imposed, established, articulated, organized, they raise difficult problems for us to understand exactly how it is, I take it, that the relationship ultimately to the institutions and the practices that are influencing, shaping our behavior and our manifestations of our truth. That, of course, then raises, I would say, the most important task for us, readers of this text and of the following text, which is to try and figure out how exactly to reintegrate this third dimension, which is the genealogy of the desiring self, this history of subjectivity, which we end up with, particularly in 1984, right, back into and not fold it back into, but how to reintegrate it into a larger project that has those three dimensions of power, knowledge, and subjectivity. I think to a certain extent, Foucault's premature death prevented that from happening. But I think that that's where the work, at least from my perspective, that's the work that remains to be done here. So let me open the floor to comments and thank our speakers again for marvelous contributions. Anne.
I've been sitting impatiently because I'm so excited by these lectures and also so excited by what you have all said. But I did want to make some claims, maybe. One, I wanted to argue with Bernard that I think there's something epistemologically very different going on here that's actually very exciting. And I'm wondering, when Achille pointed us to the place where Foucault talks about, he says, look, it's the force, right? Where does he say? It's the force of truth. Actually, I'm not sure it's the force of truth that he's opening us to in an entirely new way. I think it may actually be the force field that truth produces, that focus on a force of truth produces a new force field of an affective economy that lasts, that proliferates, that produces a new vocabulary over and over again. It's always so interesting with Foucault because you said, he's always clarifying. Actually, it's a self-clarification that keeps shifting its own ground all the time. And I think he's trying to get it right. I don't think he's like saying it because he's got it right. But I think something is happening here. What I would call a genealogy of an emotional economy in which we live. And I say that because I'd start, actually, with something far more recent that's out of mode. And it's out of modeness that actually shows us how right he was in tracking things the way he was. And it's the concept of sincerity, which is one of the most, it's a secular avowal. It is something where you're having to show something about yourself. I think when Jean's point about ideology, I actually think to think that we could have Foucault and ideology is really to misconstrue, this is my sense, Jean, really misconstrue Foucault's project.
I didn't say Foucault does ideology.
I know you didn't. I know you didn't. No. You were saying, couldn't we do both? No, you were saying, couldn't we do both? You were saying.
I said, couldn't we do all three? Ideology,
Yes.
power, knowledge,
Yes.
and regimes of truth. Basically, no.
Jean,
I didn't say everybody can do them, but these are
No.
all enterprises.
I was trying to say something else.
Sorry, go ahead. I take that. Go ahead.
I was trying to say that focusing on ideology would not really be of interest to Foucault. Others can. But what he's trying to get at is another set of practices that are much closer to the bone, I would argue, and much closer to what how subjects are created. But this notion of I want and I accept, and this ambiguous space that something like sincerity produces, to me is absolutely extraordinary, because it's this performative aspect of avowal. Can I really show you that I'm sincere? And if I say I'm sincere, at the very moment that I say I'm sincere, there can no longer be sincerity, because once you start acknowledging and being too sincere and saying you're sincere, you are no longer. So the place Foucault starts here in the beginning of these lectures is with lies, right? And it seems to me that this concept of sincerity, as it develops out of this truth of the self, actually is a moment in which so much of the contradiction of the way in which that production of the truth is seen by others, is doubted by others. It produces a vocabulary that's extraordinary around all the ways in which you have to find, to show, demonstrate, perform. It's not truth, it seems to me. You have to perform truth in particular kinds of ways within particular regimes of truth, so that terms like trust and sincerity come to the fore not only through Christianity, but through Christianity, capitalism, and empire. And one of the most sort of racially loaded ways in which you can say something in colonial archives about someone who is other is they're not sincere. They can't be sincere. They don't know what sincerity is, and they're always in disguise. So I think what we're seeing actually is the opening to a whole space of our modern sense of a genealogy of affect and the emotions that I've always chided Foucault, my last comment, that I've always chided Foucault for telling us that every sentiment has a history and then not actually showing what those sentiments were. And it seems to me that these are the lectures in which he really points some of the way for us.
Great, terrific.
Now, Kendall, Kendall Thomas, you're next.
You want to hand this to him?
Sure.
But just so that everybody can hear you.
I can be very brief.
If you want to break in also, you should.
I wanted to go back to one of Jean's two questions. And I thank her for the introduction of Weber and the speculation about what the lectures might have been had Foucault's silence on Weber been a discourse on Weber or an engagement with Weber. And you asked, is Foucault's story a secularization story? And I think you provide the beginnings of an answer in what you say is most of value in Foucault and what distinguishes him from Weber, namely this focus on discourse. I found that at least very helpful. So you actually began to offer an answer to the question, and perhaps to formulate the answer, we would say that if Foucault's story is a story of secularization, it's a story of secularization through discursivization. Although I don't know how wed I am or how wed we need to be to the idea of secularization, but I'm thinking specifically about the need, if we focus on this question of discourse, to make a set of distinctions that Foucault himself does not make, which could be made in the French, which arguably do represent a secularizing term. We've talked about this question of the relationship between confession and the l'aveu, and it occurs to me as someone who is most emphatically as the grandson of a Baptist preacher, a child of the Christian West, that if we turn from Catholicism to Protestantism, we would add a third term, which is not the confession, but the testimony, which in French would be the témoignage, which has a juridical meaning, and thus opens up to the secular in an interesting way. And through the Protestant turn, it seems to me that we're able to illuminate a number of dimensions in which the focus on discourse tells us something about the constitution of modern subjectivity that represents a contribution by Foucault over and above the work of Weber. And what I'd simply say about that is that it could be captured, this distinction between the l'aveu and the testimony, between the Catholic idea of the confession and the Protestant idea of the testimony. It could be captured in part through a phrase that Foucault does use, namely this notion of the profession of faith. But that's embedded specifically and connected to the preparation for the ritual of baptism. But in the Protestant tradition, this profession of faith is something that continues after baptism. And it has to do with the regular and ritualized telling. In the Protestant tradition in which I grew up, we called it the testimony service. And that was not so much about confessing one's sin, telling some authority figure, the priest, we didn't have them, what you had done wrong. It wasn't a recounting of sin. Rather, it was an account giving of one's salvation, right? In discourse to the larger community, right? So it was the discursivization of one's salvation and the demonstration, perhaps in Anne's terms, the performance of one's salvation through this act of testimony. And what's interesting for me is that the person who would be giving the testimony was not necessarily the vivant, but the dead, right? I'm dead to sin, and it is precisely by virtue of my status as a dead subject that I can speak about being saved from sin, right? Because we know the wages of sin are death. So one thinks here, at least I do as a preacher's kid, of a scripture that was drilled into my head coming up, James 2:26, which says, "For as the body without spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also." We might read Foucault or his account of the whole question of the confession and the Laveau as in epigrammatic form as follows: faith. It's not faith without works. It's faith without words that's dead. So the focus on discourse, I think, is a very useful one, at least for me, in getting into these lectures and understanding the relationship between discourse and the formation of modern subjectivity. There you have it.
I would like to comment a little bit on this question of secularization. I'm not convinced that. Let me put it differently. We're dealing with a Foucault who ends his life reflecting on the Iranian Revolution and writing these controversial pieces on what he calls political spirituality. The concept of political spirituality as such, it doesn't seem to me that it pertains, at least not directly, to the discourse of secularization. It is significant that he begins his study here with the opening as well as the end, with the reference to Septimius Severus. It is not just an accident. The underlying idea behind opening it up with Septimius Severus and closing it with the same character is that he doesn't believe that calculation or truth, all of that can be reduced to pure and simple utility. And it seems to me that to a large extent, I probably have to go back and read Weber, but to a large extent, Weber still believes in calculation and calculability. He still believes in utility. And here Foucault is very clear about the fact that it's not a matter of saying it doesn't exist, but he is clear about the fact that there is something beyond calculation, there is something beyond utility, which indeed he is after. To the extent then that the production of truth by logical experimental practices is only one of the possible forms of truth-speaking or truth-telling. And we have to take that seriously. It seems to me it changes fundamentally whatever we might say about Foucault and secularization. I refer on that matter to the pages from page 6 to page 8, which it seems to me these are very, very clear pages. Page 8, first paragraph.
So, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to clarify a confusion. I didn't say Foucault is a secularization thesis. I asked the question. So here's the question. He says several times, we are, who we are, our type of society, we are all Western Christian men, he says. Okay. But of course, he's writing at a period when nobody believes anything anymore. It's the 70s. People aren't, actually, if you can try and imagine this one, they weren't religious. This was the actually collapse of Christianity in Europe and in France. So the point was that the secularized person, it's the point to show the genealogy of that self. But that's one thing. But the ideas that come out in the later texts about the care of the self, an alternative to this entire continent, not just of the Christian imaginary, for which you can't do the laveur and all this discourse and stuff if you don't have the faith, because if you don't give a damn about salvation, you don't have to do any of this stuff. But his point is that actually the secular, I'll just use the word, it doesn't matter, the secularized modern individual, psychoanalysis, what have you, we're doing the same thing. Now he wants to get out of that entire continent and care of the self, and starting referring to the people you mentioned, and then the ethics of the self, the later text, I'm getting the title wrong, that is outside of that. He imagines another way of reflexive self-relation that is outside of that, that is not secularized version of this, but is something utterly different. I just don't know, my question is actually, in a sense, how you get there, but let's move on.
Okay.
What kind of break?
Jeremy, just one thing before we get there. In this conversation, I think there are many ways in which one reads these texts, and one can read them from more of a historical perspective. One can read them from more of a philosophical perspective. One can read them as I do, as more of excavating different ways in which we have imposed on ourselves, perhaps, obligations to tell a truth. And if you do it that way, then I think the questions of Christianity are less important, and in some sense, these are Christian texts. Many of them, of course, are Stoic. Many of them, Homer. We're going to go back to antiquity. So, but it's more a question of kind of how was it done in this particular text? What was the relationship to self? I don't know. Jeremy, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. Jeremy, Adam, Sheila, then Daniele, and I've got more. Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is returning to the question of ideology that Jean raised and that Anne took up to some, and Bernard took up and Anne took up to some extent. And I think there's the question of Foucault, the relationship between this idea of government by truth, the regime of truth, and versus ideology, is maybe related to the appearance of the individual at this moment in the series. And what I mean by that is that I think there are two, going back to at least psychiatric power, Foucault has two separate critiques of ideology in the Marxist framework. Right. One critique is, as was emphasized earlier, is it trades in these facile dichotomies between truth, falsity, reality, illusion, and so on and so forth. The other critique is that it depends, that the concept of ideology depends on the idea of a dominant class, and depends on the idea of class struggle, that it doesn't make sense to talk about ideology without having this sort of metaphysics of classes beneath it. And Foucault makes both of those critiques many times. And I make that distinction because this is a discussion we've had, and perhaps it's irresolvable. But I agree with Jean just emphatically that the first critique of ideology, the critique of that Marxist ideology, doesn't, as perhaps Anne suggested, doesn't go deep enough to the bone. I just think is insupportable. It is just, I just think Foucault is dealing in perhaps not bad faith, but just a lack of interest in certain interlocutors. So Althusser, by this point by the late 70s, Tronti, Suzanne de Brunnhoff, there are just so many, putting aside the Frankfurt School, there are just so many Marxist theories. I'm just even saying his direct contemporaries. There are so many Marxist theories of ideology that have given accounts of ideology that are all about effective economy, that are all about the personal, the individual, at the deepest, most concrete level of everyday practice. So I just think, I remain unconvinced that Foucault offers anything really new there. It may offer a more felicitous way of phrasing certain insights, but I think in that sense, his account doesn't really break with ideology. Where it does break is on the second critique, I think. On the second critique he has, where it does break, where I think he does break with ideology, and what I think his truly deep problem with ideology is its dependence on the notion of the reality of classes, on the idea of class subjects that would be both the generators and the bearers of ideology. And that, I think there's no doubt that he truly and emphatically and logically has rejected that theory of ideology in this work and in previous years. But that then raises that makes all the more important and politically powerful to me this increasing emphasis on the individual. The question being, does whatever Foucault is doing, which I think is largely like ideology critique in many respects, and does much of the work of ideology critique in its sophisticated forms, but is focused now on the individual subject, that raises the question, does his approach have the juice to deal with collectives? Even if you don't want to believe in a theory of classes, does Foucault, does this account, does it have anything to say about collective subjects? And here you could just contrast this so powerfully with sort of Sartre's late writing, which is all about Sartre's late writing in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, which is all about trying to get beyond a vulgar conception of class, but develop a way of talking about various kinds of collective subjectivity and collective subject formation. It's here what we see is Foucault really breaking fundamentally, not just with class, but an interest in collective subjectivity altogether. That to me is the big distinction, not subjectivity versus non-subjectivity, but collective subjectivity versus individual subjectivity being the only kind of subjectivity.
Adam?
So does this work like this? The mic's good like this?
Yeah.
So I was very fascinated by the effort, Achille, Jean, and all of you to sort of pin down what the central question of the lectures really is. And I think I agree that the definition, it comes again and again, but the one on 80 is as good as any, the government of men through the manifestation of truth in the form of subjectivity. But he is tempted again and again by something else, right?
Yeah.
Which you see on page 101, where it says basically what I'd like to do and know that I will not be able to do, but I'd like to do it, is to write a history of the force of truth, a history of the power of the truth, a history therefore to take the same idea from a different angle of the will to know. And that for me was so resonant because it puts in play another interpretive context. So clearly the more restricted definition on page 80 points us back towards governmentality and the history of biopolitics and those kind of themes. That other more expansive definition, more lyrical as well, takes us towards the will to know, which takes us back to the very first lecture series. And I think it was quite interesting to compare this citing, and I love the way Bernard was describing it, these sort of ruminative kind of going back over the same terrain. So what are the differences? And I can think of at least three. I mean, one is historic. So what is the crucial epoch to be looking at? And in the first lecture series, it really is ground zero. It's the transition from the pre-Socratics to the Socratics. That's where he has to have the battle. I think it's because of the discussion with Derrida. And that's where the terrain has to be had out. Exactly. And here we've inched forward, backwards, and the main emphasis on the Christians, but that's one difference. Another one relates to Jeremy's point, which is that in that first lecture series, around the edges, there is this strong sociological reading of that moment, of the disappointed struggle over land, the enormous political upheavals within the Greek polities at this moment, which he sees as the backdrop, right? So there's that kind of almost Maoist reading of the land question that's sitting in the background that will echo forward at least for 2 or 3 more lecture series after that. But then the third thing, which is really goes back, I think, to one of Achilles' sort of gnawing questions, and perhaps to your point about epistemology, and from there on to this question about ideology, which is that in that first lecture series, he's far bolder than he is here, because he takes the question of truth and a critical history of truth in its full and radical consequence for our thought, which is that it poses the question of the status of the text itself, right? Because in the text itself, we're going to make some truth claims, and in this text, we are going to destabilize our understanding by a critical history of what truth is and how it comes to be in the world. And there's that amazing, delirious Nietzschean fragment of a lecture in the Will to Know compilation that we have, where really this spins as far as it could go. And we're not on that terrain at all at this point here. And it has, to me, the same calmness that Jeremy and I were identifying in the transition from society must be defended to security, territory, and population. The reflexive question, the question of your own positioning and its place within conflict and within the conflicted history of truth, is no longer being posed here. And to that extent, it seems to me he's also dodging the fundamental questions about his critique of truth as opposed to a critique of ideology, because a critique of ideology and a sociology of knowledge places that precisely in play. And we don't have to do that here. And we don't have to do that here because we've narrowed the whole thing down to the procedures through which we can show the effects of a certain sort of truth-telling with regard to a certain sort of subjectivity formation. But that is, in a sense, also all we're doing at this point, by comparison with the far wider ambition of that earlier project and the far wider ambition of a truly comprehensive critique of ideology.
And as to your first point and your theme that you've often repeated about the conversation with Derrida, you see it come back here twice, right, in these lectures, right? Sheila.
Okay, as Bernard knows, I had great difficulty getting my hands on this book until this morning, so I'm a little bit like the student who hasn't done her homework. But I have a disquiet about the argument of this book as I have understood it, as I have read in it. And I want to put this very carefully because it can be easily misunderstood. And the way I want to put it is this. Can we write a genealogy of subjectivity in today, in 2015, with basically an archaeology of ancient Greek philosophy and Christianity that precludes all other cultural discussions and others? Let me try to phrase this from within Foucault's project rather than coming at it sort of as if I'm just sort of raising a politically correct critique. I do want to raise this question about the politics of culture in this approach. Both Achille and Bernard came back to this question about salvation and truth and what this may have, what relevance this may have to our contemporary moment. I think that Achille posed the question but did not answer it. Bernard, the way you did it is saying that this genealogy still operates in our criminal justice system. In fact, we convict people because they confess, they avow, and so on. I understand that. But it is really astonishing to me, okay, that there is no discussion of the relationship of Christianity, Judaism, Gnosticism. There is not even, a nod of the head towards the relationship of Arabic philosophy, its translation of Greek philosophy, and the interrelationship between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. I just don't know that we can tell this story today, historically, from a cultural historian's point of view. I certainly don't have the knowledge to be able to rewrite this. I don't, and Foucault is fantastic. But let me just give you a few suggestions. Achille was saying acts of faith that characterize this moment of the liturgy, acts of faith and acts of confession in the sense of aveu, okay? Now, as far as I know anything about Islam and Judaism, the moment of aveu does not exist in that same way. An act of confession, it does. In Islam, one says Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which is the Shahada. In Judaism, you say, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu. It is the same word. It is the same word where you're addressing God, you're negotiating with God. But there is no claim placed upon you to avow your subjectivity. This may be one of the problems that we do have to understand in understanding the relationship of salvation and truth today. It is not the same demand that is placed in these two other world religions as it is on Christianity. And therefore, these huge misunderstandings can take place. I mean, I wish Jean Anitzar was here, because this is the work that he does. But just two more examples from etymology, and then I'll keep quiet. In Arabic, the word shahada, shahid, is the same word that is used when you are killed in battle and you bear witness to God. Why are they related? Why should they be? Why should they be related, right? And in Judaism, what you are saying is you are negotiating with God in the name of your people. We, the people of Israel, you're not negotiating in the name of yourself. So I have this kind of disquiet about really being able to tell the history of modern subjectivity by sort of really occluding the others. And I think it is part of the problems, the deep problems of our present, that we don't know how to talk to each other across these divides.
Yeah, we've been having a few conversations about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I just came to.
No, not. I was referring to.
Oh yes, yes,
Other conversations. Yeah, very important. Okay.
Just a footnote to what
yes.
has been said about Foucault not envisioning the least that this history of subjectivity might include others. It's fascinating that actually Foucault never gets out of his own Western world. The only time he did that was with Iran, and this admiration that one doesn't really understand for the Ayatollah. Actually, what raised my willingness to intervene, it's the same thing actually. Shahid, as and the French word, which is Greek first, martyr, it is exactly the same thing. The martyr is the witness, and also the one who dies for what he or she witnesses, which is the truth. This idea which you find in Pascal. Pascal says, "Je ne croirais que les témoins qui se feraient égorger." In other words, if you're, oui, ils ne sont plus là, but then they are somehow the truth in itself standing. That is probably the link that you can see between shahada, shahid, and martyr, and as witness, and martyrdom as dying for or killing for that truth. The very fact that you are dying being the truth in itself in this case, which is, oh, she left.
No, she's right back. She'll be right back.
Okay, well, so I drop it.
Okay.
It was about anarchism, but it doesn't make sense if Jean is out.
Okay. All right. So, Daniele, did you want to jump in? So the way I've got a few more people on the queue. Daniele, did you want to jump in? And then at the end, I'm going to let you give a 5.
Yeah, it was also about Weber, maybe.
But go ahead.
Okay. Okay. No, it was just to add something that Foucault says in 1982 in a series of lectures that I'm editing now in Toronto, and he tries to describe what he's interested in. So the conferences are the title of the conferences is Dire vrai sur soi-même, so truth telling about to oneself, and he contrasts what he's doing with what the Weberian school is doing. So he basically addressed this question, and of course he does that in a very schematic way, but this gives us maybe one one additional clue to this in order to address this question. So Foucault says, basically, my problem is in fact the general problem I pose is in fact a similar problem than Weber's one. Comment les sujets a été amené dans nos sociétés à se déchiffrer lui-même. How the subject is conducted in our societies to decipher himself. But he says in Weber and Weberians pose this problem in a way which is the following. Quel est les prix ascétiques de la raison, which is the ascetic price of reason, which means if we want to have a rational conduct, if we want to have, if we want to construct and to build our action on true principles, what are the interdictions that we have to impose on ourselves? What part of ourselves must we or should we, just put aside in order to get to this rational truth? And Foucault says, I'm trying to pose the la question inverse. I'm trying to see the things the other way around. Comment certaines connaissances ont-elles constitué les prix à payer pour faire valoir une interdiction? Donc, how in our societies, Western Christian, certain knowledge, a certain kind of knowledge, has been constituted as the price we have to pay in order to legitimize a certain interdiction. And what part of ourselves we have to know if we want to renounce or to interdict something. So it's of course something that complexifies things. And it's not an answer. It's just to say that Foucault asks himself this kind of question, and he kind of sees and he kind of tries to differentiate in a very clear way what he's doing from what he says that Weber was doing. Okay, I stop here.
So let's do this. I've got three more comments. We'll try and keep them a little bit short, and then we'll give 5 minutes to each of our guests to close the evening. Okay, starting with you.
Just a short comment on the ideology versus regimes of truth. This has been covered, but I just wanted to make a brief comment because I was left thinking of Jean's question as to whether Foucault's analysis of regimes of truth is supposed to replace ideology, critique, or could we have both? And it seems to me that if we leave aside Foucault's explicit critique of ideology, which of course is, as you said, contains levels and so on, but if we leave aside the explicit comments and focus on what he's doing here, then I think we could have both, and in fact should have both, in the sense that what is happening here is something very different. Of course, it depends again what we mean by ideology, and I'm not sure I understand what is meant by ideology, but surely Christianity can be approached as an ideology, and then it would essentially be a set of beliefs or something like that. And it seems clear that Foucault is here not interested in that at all.
Right.
He's not interested in approaching Christianity on that level as a set of beliefs, but on a completely different level, perhaps more fundamental level, as a set of conditions, rules, constraints, obligations for telling the truth. So I think this would at least be one way of trying to relate the two and say that this is not about ideology critique, but trying to do something different.
Great, thank you. John?
Yeah, I just wanted very quickly to underscore some of the ways that these particular lectures and our discussion might give us a handle on this perennial problem question of the distinction between the subject and the self. And the kind of starting point when I think about it was that wonderful phrase about the center of gravity of subjectivity in the first presentation, and the idea of turning oneself into another, which seems related to, but also distinct from, how Foucault defines subjectivity as the relation of self to self, or the exercise of the self on the self, which again seems related to, but also distinct from, the kind of reflexivity that's built into the self-reflexivity, self-identicality, that kind of binding of the self with the self that will become so important in the later lectures. So I just wanted to kind of underscore that question of the subject versus the self.
Thank you, John. Dana Paula?
I'm trying to do this quickly.
Okay.
I wanted to, maybe this is a slightly weird comment, but I wanted to try and argue a relation of this text, of this course. Oh, the microphone's over.
And could you pass him the...
Yeah. I wanted to argue a connection of this course to the one we looked at 2 weeks ago, Birth of Biopolitics. There was an interesting Freudian slip last week and this week where a couple people kept calling the title The Birth of Politics, which I thought was kind of interesting. But I wanted to go back to a comment you made, or a very interesting comments you made 2 weeks ago, saying that one of the things we perhaps needed if we're going to have a theory of neoliberalism is also a theory of neoliberal subjectification, how people literally buy into a market economy. And to the extent then that what Foucault is giving us here is a genealogy of Christian subjectivity, which at times then starts to slide into a theory of Western subjectivity. You read the passage on 266 where he says Christian subjectivity, which is the same as Western subjectivity. To that extent, could we continue the genealogy and argue that neoliberalism is a derivative of Christian subjectivity? And I think we see some indications of that. I mean, evangelical republicanism is an embodiment of that. But already in The Birth of Biopolitics, you see Foucault analyzing a kind of religiosity to philosophies of the market, a kind of spiritualism. And going back to Jean's point, I would say that at times what you see in Foucault's analysis of neoliberalism is not civil society as a remedy to the market, because there's almost a sense that markets don't need remedies. They are themselves godly. They have an invisible hand. They're driven by competition makes us better. Competition raises us up and spiritualizes us. If that's the case, then the question I would want to ask is, do we also see some of the related phenomena of Christianity in neoliberalism? Do we see self-interrogation? Do we see confession? Do we see apologetics? Do we see mortification? I mean, I think one place we see it is when leftists become neoliberal market apologists. There's very much this mortification. I died to become again something else. So it's just a side thought.
All right, great. Something to pursue.
Maybe write a book about. Okay, so I'm going to ask our guests to give some concluding thoughts to maybe wrap things together for us. So
okay, I'll try. I'll try on.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'll try on 2 points, and what the first point is that I have been. It was really striking for me too to approach these lectures. I listened to these lectures at the IMEC in France before they were published, so this gives a completely different relationship to the lectures. Just hearing the voice and Foucault speaking and so on, and actually the question of the overlapping that Foucault is doing in these lectures about the genealogy of the subject, of the Western subject, and of the Christian subject is really something striking for us. I think that it's not there's no question about that, and I think that from this point of view, we should try to problematize what is doing here and to replace it in a larger perspective. But I think that it tells us also something interesting about the way in which he was interpreting his own present. I mean, he was not trying to give us I don't know, complete history or genealogy of the subject or subjectivity. He was trying to start from a problem, from a problem that he, Michel Foucault, in 1980 saw in his society, which was the fact that basically the way in which subjects, individuals were obliged to tell the truth about themselves, or the fact that the relationship between subjectivity and truth was, according to him, still largely modeled on a series of processes that it tried, just to bring back to early Christianity and then to Stoic philosophy and so on. So it was not his problem, I think, to give us a complete genealogy of the subject itself, because the subject itself is a concept that he constantly criticized, and that I argue he still criticizes in the 80s. So it's not a question of the subject; it's a question of how this way of the fact that the truth and the fact that the truth I can say about myself matters in the way that I am governed and so on. Well, how can we try to retrace a genealogy of that? And it goes towards Christianity. And I think that we can do other genealogies that go towards other different historical experiences. And then these are all, pieces of a puzzle that we can, bring together. And I think I just stop here.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Jean?
Too close. I agree with that. It's sort of weird because the stuff in ideology, I thought, and if you look at my post, that's in some way the least interesting. I just said it because I couldn't let it pass and I want to get rid of it. And please, of course, I understand, having read his works before I read the lectures, I know that he's not doing ideology critique. That's not the point. That doesn't need to be explained to me. It is a different episteme. It is a different practice, and I think it's project and practice, and I highly value it. So, and I guarantee you, I understand the difference. It was a different question, though, and that is, the question was, after this shift and transformation and an ongoing project, is there still room for? So the first question, is there still room for the other? And I think there is. The second question is that, with respect to what Johanna said about the faith aveu distinction, the whole point of that distinction is to say, I don't give a damn about faith, I'm going to talk about l'aveu, and I'm not going to get into the way in which this produces a subject, et cetera, et cetera. However, all I want to do is make a little point to think about, that you're not going to have, at least in this imaginary, the Christian one, you can't have those practices without the faith. And if you lose the faith, right. And so there were lots of people who were engaged in ideology critique of the faith part because they want to get rid of the practices. Anyway, leave that alone. The really important thing for me was whether and to think how and if. I mean, in a way, if this, the bad news would be if this really was a secularization thesis. Because it would be secular and what really annoyed me, and this sort of picks up on something Michel was alluding to, because I'm not a Christian subject. Anyway, Christian subjectivity, Western subjectivity. Now, you could claim that it's so saturated by those practices that even if you're Jewish, Muslim, and you hear, they got you. Okay, that's one possibility. Okay, but the other point and it's very important, is that it would be much more interesting. Okay, what if it's secularization thesis, then how do we get out of this? And it can't be that you're not religious anymore because that's the secularization thesis. So how do you get out of this? And his other works, what is it called? The Care of the Self? Mm-hmm. Right, okay, the other stuff, is about other practices, regimes of constructing the self, etc., or different kind of regimes of truth. We're not going to become Greek. Maybe we should, but anyway, we're not going to become Greek. But so it'd be another way. We'd step out of this whole dispositif. It would be a totally different way of being self-reflexive, which is fine. The problem is not self-reflexivity, and performing, creating, practicing. I don't care what we do. The self. Now, the second question that I asked at the end is, yeah, I can go for that, but how do we get there? Are we already there? How do we get there? And that was a question of the breakthrough, of the transformation of. Anyway, that's all. So, this was great.
Thank you, Jean. Actually.
Okay, 3 points. The first one is the extent to which the Foucault we have been reading this evening is not only an historian of that, but is also a theologian. He's a very fine theologian, as far as one can see. He is under the spell. Jean, you were wondering why St. Augustine is not in. You didn't talk about him, you spoke about Max Weber. He is not in because Foucault is entirely under the spell of Tertullian. So I suggest that we take seriously the fact that Foucault is a theologian, a political theologian for that matter. Second point, and is rejoined to what Sheila and Anne in another context have raised. It seems to me there are many, of course, different ways of reading a text like this. One is to do an exegese. The other one is to bring the text to interrogate the text from not the perspective of antiquity or the fathers of the church, but from contemporary questions. Absolutely. Those questions that we are facing in the United States of America, in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, or for that matter, the Middle East. If we do that, the text will give us different kinds of responses, and we'll be able to interpret it well beyond Foucault's own intentions. But in order to make the text speak beyond its times, it is important, and Sheila was making that point in her own way, it's important to question its archives. Work, and you have been working on these archives. Can we really, in the process of writing a genealogy of the modern subject, can we rely on regional archives? How is it that we reopen the so-called Western archives as such, knowing very well that what is called Western archives is in fact a co-production. It has never been the exclusive property of the West as such. Knowing very well that we cannot, other parts of the world cannot allow themselves to be evicted from that very archive. Right. It seems to me that is the only way in which we can make Foucault speak beyond what is clearly a provincial understanding of the world at large. One last point. What would the politics of truth look like now, here and now? What are the technologies of truth that saturate our times, here and now? Of course, part of those technologies are still do still rely on the religious. But the religious as such is not simply the religious of monotheistic faiths. Although it is still the case to some extent, for instance, with the universalization of evangelical Christianity, which has become, in fact, but we have probably to understand the religious. I say, I think your name is Dana. Yeah, in a way, Dana suggested. We have to understand it somewhat in the way Benjamin was speaking about capitalism becoming a religion. The question being, but okay, let's assume that it is becoming a religion. The question is, what kind of religion? And here my suggestion would be that it is becoming an animist religion. That what we are witnessing is a convergence of capitalism on the one hand and animism on the other, which some call neoliberalism or whatever, but the turning of things into their metamorphosizing into other forms of the living. And that question of, Foucault called it second life, rebirth and the rest. That convergence of capitalism and animism, it seems to me that that is the very locus where the new subjectivities of today are being formed. All of that in a context in which the question of the relationship between salvation and truth has become, let's say, the question of our times.
All right, thank you all. Thank you for this. So next time we'll be meeting on March 3rd. We'll be meeting here on March 3rd. Judith Butler will be here with us. Now, we're turning to the 1981 lectures, Vérité et Subjectivité. Those lectures have not been translated into English yet. So you have a French version of the 1981 lectures. Hold on, or whatever. We have the French, so you can read the French version, but in conversation with Judith, we've also decided to use for the English version Wrongdoing, Truth-Telling, which is the Louvain lectures that happened right after Vérité and Subjectivité in March and right in Louvain. So please read the French, Subjectivité and Vérité, if you can and want to, but we'll also be addressing Wrongdoing, Truth-Telling, okay?
One on the 25th of February?
No.